Okay, sorry. Give me 2 seconds and I'll get, I've prepared some slides. They can be a little text heavy, but that's partly because I've discovered that when putting slides on Zoom, I can't see the notes as well. Feel free to absolutely ignore them. So, my name's Emma, and I'm going to be talking on this. There we go. Can anyone see the slides? The screen, is that coming up?
Yeah, we can see the slides, I think. Yeah, we can.
Thank you. Sorry, my screen froze for a moment. So I'm going to be talking on the idea of queer futures. So what I'm doing here is thinking through in very loose ways the juxtaposition in the meeting of a couple of different ideas. The first being xenofeminism, and asking and exploring that through a crip lens, and asking if queer futures have space for crip joy. So of this paper is less to come to a conclusion, but to have a productive and perhaps also unproductive conversation between these two ideas. Xenofeminism and crip both borrowing heavily from queer, and vice versa. So to give you a little background on this, xenofeminism is a technomaterialist, anti-naturalist and gender abolitionist feminist approach. So the idea being that it is a call for imagining futures around technology, and a rejection of seeing nature as a limit to technology. In particular, the reason I feel it sits heavily within queer as well is its approach to gender abolition. The idea of that it isn't about having an end to a gender binary so much as space for multiple genders to develop. Xenofeminism was developed by the initial text that I rely on was developed by a collective under the name Laboria Carbonics, and there's kind of been some more recent pieces written around it. And as Carbonics has written, xenofeminism isn't a bid for revolution so much as a wager on the long game of history. It's demanding imagination, dexterity, and persistence. And I feel this is, it overlaps with crip science, particularly crip approaches to technology. In particular, this idea of technology becoming an activist tool. So technologies, as Helen Hester writes, technologies are constrained and constituted through and by social relations. So for those of you who may or may not be familiar with crip, crip is rooted in disability and the lived experience of disability, but in particular it is, to quote Haraway and Frisch, it's the non-compliant anti-assimilationist position that disability is a desirable part of the world. And it's also thinking about this, the ways, a field of relations, a way of experiencing and a way of knowing that enables the flourishing of crip ways of producing and engaging with the world. So it's thinking about what disability brings to the world, but also its central point is saying that disability and being disabled is not a negative. It is desirable. And for me, that sits with and against xenofeminism in the ways which I'm going to go on to explore. So for me, I'm taking a quote from Braidotti, who was referring to feminist technoscience and readings of that. But a crip reading of xenofeminism for me is this joyful act of disobedience, and it's a resolute betrayal. It's in some ways a speaking back to, but also a reminder. So xenofeminism kind of as positioned, and Queeronics have positioned themselves as Haraway's disobedient daughters. There's very much this rooting in cyborg theory and technoscience more broadly as well. And cyborg theory is absent disabled people, our interactions with technology and a world infused with technology. And xenofeminism is the same, and it runs the same risks as Haraway. In that there is a single mention of disability in the Xenofeminist Manifesto, and it refers to the differently abled rather than the disabled. So you can tell from the language used that there is a discomfort with disability there, and after that it's not returned to. And for me, there is still a hope with it through reading xenofeminism through a crip lens. There is still room for hope, because as Helen Hester points out, that in collecting, discarding and revising existing perspectives, in stripping its myriad influences for parts, xenofeminism positions itself as a project for which the future remains open as a site of radical recomposition. And for me, that means there is space for disability to be thought of, and a space for disability to be made desirable. But it also has to be a deliberate engagement with disability. So it's, for me, this I'm borrowing a quote from Alison Kafer in Cripping this idea of future making as a process of estrangement and defamiliarization, of developing ideas which are discomforting and developing space for discomfort and awkwardness, which can so often be embodied by disabled movement through the world. And the reason I kind of have this moment of discomfort with xenofeminism is the eugenicist urge in technoscience and ecofuturism. So I want to nod to it and then return to a more positive reading. So xenofeminism for me, it doesn't engage with the eugenicist urge. There's a silence on it, but there is a parallel thinking of the idea of disability as not just undesirable but burdensome. And a disability is a burden on the environment. Disability as a burden on on making society anew. So while xenofeminism envisages a just post-capitalist feminist future, that, for me, the only way that it can be just is it must be not just inclusive of disability, but embracing a willful inclusion and a willful development of space for disability, whatever disability may look like within that future. So to kind of pick at this a little bit more, there's xenofeminism thinks about positions as itself as against nature and against naturalism, this refusal to frame nature as only and always the unyielding limits to emancipatory imaginaries. But we see disability as seen as both natural and unnatural. And I'm going to draw here again on Alison Kafer's work, thinking about who gets to be natural and who gets to be in nature. And through a crip reading of xenofeminism, we can add to that who gets to go outside of and beyond nature, whose body mind, whose existence is able to transcend. And this is a positioning of the risk of positioning disability as natural, and disability as binarized as against the civilized non-disabled, with technology in particular positioned as a cure, as we look at the ideas of edited genes, walking exoskeletons, and so on. It's thinking about how those technologies may in fact be rejected by disabled people, how disabled people may have not just a discomfort, but a wholesale rejection of these technologies. And the natural disabled body mind becomes quite often positioned as this burden on the future, both within ecofeminism, within technoscience. No matter which ideological and theoretical positioning we are imagining a future, disability is excluded from it. So it's thinking about what we might include and what we might lose through losing disability. And for me, the concepts of crip technoscience becomes really, really useful and interesting. And it's this informed refusal of a positioning of disability as burden, both in terms of lived reality now, but also as in worlds to come. And for me, this is where the productivity, and there is a productivity in the conversation between xenofeminism and crip, in that they're thinking through these effective engagements with technology and the ways in which technoscience is used and developed. And then if we read through Haraway and Frisch's work alongside Jones and Hester, it becomes really apparent that the practices described by Haraway and Frisch already fit with xenofeminism's vision of future possibilities. Their disabled people are already doing this future. So examples of this are hackable, easy to maintain wheelchairs, fragrance-free cosmetic production, DIY artificial insemination. It's the engagement with lived experience through technology. And As Carbonics writes of this need to redeploy existing technologies and invent novel cognitive and material tools in the service of common ends, we see within it, particularly within hackable wheelchairs and fragrance-free production, cosmetic production, this embracing of crip science from Leah Lakshmi Pesna Samarshina's conceptions around care work, and also Mia Mingus's access intimacy, the idea that there is an intimacy created through access, through making accessibility. It is, and through making spaces in which disabled people no longer have to ask for access, where access is already there, is a form of intimacy, a form of love, and a form of care, but also a positioning of the disabled body mind as desirable, as wanted within that space. And I think Alison Kafer speaks really well to this, because as she writes, disabled people are not cyborgs because of our bodies, such as our use of prosthetics, ventilators or attendants, but because of our political practices and the ways in which technology is engaged with. So to finish it off briefly, the joy that I initially wanted to think through. Access intimacy is the source of crip joy. It is about a welcoming space. And queering and cripping what it means to make a future means, for me, embracing the pleasures of misfitting, embracing the pleasures of a body-mind that doesn't work in normative ways. And it's an active rejection of an ableist hetero future. It's the joyous rejection. It's not a resigned rejection or a despairing rejection. It's a joyous and a deliberate stepping away and through. And we see this as well in the ways in which we can think about moving in crip time, in the pleasures of misfitting, the pleasures of embracing different ways of moving through the world, and these queer crip practices of relating, loving and joining. I'm going to finish there.
Amazing. Thank you very much.